how the people are doing. So here's the thing about this comparison. Now, on one hand we have the OnePlus 13, flagship killer, really good cameras for the price, but on the other hand the Xiaomi 14 Ultra. A lot of people actually believe that I don't like the Xiaomi 14 Ultra. They really enjoy the professional approach and the style of photography and videography that the Xiaomi has. It strays away from the smartphone processed look that we usually get from a lot of phones, like the OnePlus 13 as well. But the fact is simple. When it comes to a camera comparison, I think these are not for people who are into professional photography. It makes no sense. Right, because if you want professional photography, you just take a raw photograph and then you edit it all the way to high heaven or back to hell. Up to you. You can do whatever you want with it. That's the whole point. But when you're testing out auto photography or portrait mode and so on and so forth, then it's the best way to put it is that regular people will not care about these kinds of professional modes that the Xiaomi 14 Ultra has, and it's important that they know. That's the whole point. That's why I go for these camera comparisons. That's why I try to be as impartial as possible to the Xiaomi 14 Ultra, even though it is actually one of my all-time favorites. Just want to clarify that. So starting off with, of course, our color profiles. Now, here's the deal with the OnePlus 13. It doesn't really have genuine color options. By that I mean that the OnePlus will give you certain options like a vibrant mode and a slightly more natural looking mode and so on and so forth, but they are not consistent. They're not consistent at all. I've tested them out. They don't really work out all that well. Sometimes they're going to give you photos that look almost exactly the same as the default mode. Other times it's going to go way too crazy. Stuff like that, it doesn't look good. The Xiaomi, on the other hand, it has Leica Vibrant, which, as you can probably tell, it is already giving us a good amount of contrast and it looks really nice. Very similar to the OnePlus 13 here. But then the way I like to use it, Leica Authentic. See, this one goes balls to the walls crazy with the contrast. And it is also fairly natural when it comes to colors. It can sometimes neutralize warmth from a scene a little too much, sometimes desaturate a little too much in that regard as well. But for the most part, this one is one of the most, as I mentioned previously, very professional looking, very almost DSLR camera looking type of color mode that we have here. And that's something that a lot of people like. I love it, personally speaking. But I also think that most people will actually prefer the OnePlus 13, regular people, who just want a camera that can take good photos. That's all they care about. They might find the OnePlus 13 far more balanced in that regard. And with the main camera at the very least, when it comes to daylight shots, that is exactly what it comes down to. There's no realistic, major, massive difference between the two. They both work out tremendously well. Even dynamic range turns out to be really nice. And overall, it's only a matter of differences when it comes to contrast, maybe even a bit of saturation here and there. But one thing that you should bear in mind is that oftentimes the Xiaomi 14 Ultra will just not sharpen images. The OnePlus, on the other hand, will most definitely sharpen images, and it is kind of visible in certain images, not so much in others. It really depends on the scene, but sometimes, especially when you have a lot of fine details, you can really see the sharpening happening, like in some of the leaves in these shots here. Well, that again, it depends on your personal preference. Some might see that as a genuine boost in details. Others might just see that as overprocessing that they don't want and it's just undesirable. It really depends on what you want. Now, personally, my pick, based on these photographs that we have taken, I would say the Xiaomi 14 Ultra would be the way I would go. And when it comes to the ultra-wide cameras, I think it is once again a very, very similar story. I do believe that the Xiaomi goes for even more contrast when it comes to the ultra-wide camera, and that's something I find very desirable. Once again, it is something I really like. I definitely believe that it goes for a very pushed and very punchy approach, but it doesn't really lose out on the natural colors, and that's the beautiful thing about this phone. I mean, it should be plenty obvious through and through. Like, the contrast is pushed to the limits on the Xiaomi in so many of these shots. Even if it's backlit, you're still gonna see a whole bunch of contrast happening on the Xiaomi, and again, that is something that I find to be really nice, and honestly, I really like that, personally speaking. Like, that's the kind of shot I would want. But I also believe that a lot of people might want to go for the much safer, much flatter looking approach that we have on the OnePlus 13, which will give you a lot more shadow detail. Because one thing that we should bear in mind is that once shadow detail is gone, you can't really get it back. But if you have shadow detail, you can always bump up the contrast, and maybe a flat looking image will turn out to be very punchy. There's always a lot more control when you have more detail available to you from the get-go. And of course, one last thing that we should absolutely bear in mind is that the Xiaomi 14 Ultra has a much wider field of view. It is quite possibly one of the widest cameras when it comes to an ultra-wide. And honestly, the OnePlus isn't bad, but it doesn't really stand a chance. Like, this is, you take a shot from the Xiaomi 14 Ultra, you don't even have to think about it. You can immediately tell that the ultra-wide shot is from an ultra-wide camera. That has actually not been the case for quite a few recent devices, which is kind of unfortunate. Next up, of course, we have macro photography, but I also might have a bit of a scandal for you guys here. So the OnePlus 13 goes for telephoto macro, which is great. Like the moment you turn on macro mode, it goes to 3x, indicating that it's trying to use the 3x telephoto camera for macro photography. Now, as you can probably tell, compared to the Xiaomi 14 Ultra, the quality of the OnePlus 13 is really not that good. There's a lot of sharpening, a lot of processing. It just doesn't look as nice. You would expect it to be much nicer given that it is using optical zoom with really good lighting, so why doesn't it look good? Well, there is something very intriguing going on and we'll get to it in a moment, but before that, we can also actually do a 6x sensor crop. Now, I don't know if it's actually a sensor crop or if, well, there's a lot of implications going on here. Again, I'll get to that, but the 6x, as you can probably tell, it does not look good. The Xiaomi 14 Ultra, even though it cannot do a 6x, it still just looks a lot better, a lot more naturally detailed as opposed to whatever the OnePlus is doing. Now, the whole situation with the macro is weird because the 3x sensor on the OnePlus 13, it's supposed to be good, but that's when I realized. I was trying to take a close-up, high-resolution shot with the OnePlus 13 using the 3x, and I realized that it couldn't focus to save its own life. I mean, this is the best result I could get from the OnePlus 13. It looks ridiculous, right? Well, it is ridiculous. Which made me think, how is the OnePlus 13 using the 3x for telephoto macro if it cannot even take a proper high-res and focus? It shouldn't be a problem, right? Because on the Xiaomi now we are using high-res and it's the exact same kind of shot. I mean, even when I moved way farther back, you can see the OnePlus 13 still isn't able to focus on the flower. It's focusing on the vase right back there. I used tap to focus, it still cannot do it. Which is what leads me to believe that quite possibly we have some kind of digital crop happening with the 3x macro that we have. It doesn't seem like it's a telephoto macro. That's what I'm saying, because the 3x is, as you can probably tell, not exactly capable of focusing. And also it kind of makes sense when you think about the fact that your detail preservation and over processing, it's all really bad when it comes to macro photography, in particular when it's trying to use a 3x. So it sort of paints a picture, doesn't it? Like OnePlus is saying that they're using the 3x for macro, but they're not really because there's problems there. But look, I'm just gonna leave you guys to judge this because I don't even know what to think of this. Like honestly, it makes no sense. Like why even bother with this? It just, I don't know. I can't really wrap my head around this at the moment, so we're gonna move straight over to zoom. This time with a 2x sensor crop. So cropping into 500%, and I mean this isn't exactly surprising. The Xiaomi 14 Ultra, it gives you a much nicer shot, which is to say that it is almost similarly detailed, actually a little bit more detailed, but it has significantly less over sharpening and processing and artifacts and all that jazz. And that's basically what the Xiaomi is known for, you know. But of course, what about 3x? Now this time there's no close-up, so we know that OnePlus is actually using the 3x telephoto camera, and that's exactly what's going up against the Xiaomi 14 Ultra's 3x telephoto. And well, would you look at that, 500% crop, and the detail preservation is almost identical. If anything, I would say that there's maybe a bit of processing happening on the Xiaomi 14 Ultra. It's a very, very minor difference. And then of course we have 6x, which is basically a 2x sensor crop on top of the 3x. And OnePlus really pushes it, like they have a separate 3x zoom toggle right beside the 3x so that you can know that yes, you're using 6x and it is something that you're supposed to use or you can use. Now whether or not it gives us good quality, well, that's a whole different story. The Xiaomi of course goes for a very optical approach. We have a 5x, which is, by the way, really, really high quality 5x. Like it's actually, relatively speaking, I think it's a better camera as opposed to the 3x telephoto that we have on the Xiaomi. And cropping in all the way, it's pretty obvious that the OnePlus isn't really doing enough because, as you can probably tell, the 6x isn't really able to produce nearly as much detail and avoid as much processing as the Xiaomi 14 Ultra. Now once again, I do believe that if we had just a pinch of sharpening on the Xiaomi, it could be a near perfect result. You could get a ton more detail, but I'm more than certain that the sharpening would not be particularly visible. So with that said, let us now move on to high resolution, starting off with our main camera with 50 megapixels on both. And as usual, cropping into 500%, that's a staggering difference. Now, I do feel like for some odd reason the OnePlus isn't focusing, even though I use tap to focus and it just It's like it's missing the focus by a millimeter or something like that because it looks very awkward. The Xiaomi, on the other hand, it is obviously more detailed, that goes without saying, but it also appears kind of sharpened, doesn't it? Or am I mistaken? Because I feel like, especially a lot of the specs on the black marble, it kind of looks a little bit sharpened. Now, I'm not really sure why, because usually the Xiaomi almost never sharpens, especially when it comes to high res, it completely avoids it. So I'm not sure what happened here exactly, because both of them are just not exactly acting their part now, are they? But anyways, let us now check out ultra wide camera. And as you can probably tell, the field of view is so much wider on the Xiaomi that even though, as you can probably tell, I kind of moved it a little bit closer, I still couldn't get it to match quite as well. And while cropping all the way in, see now this is kind of the thing that I expected with the main camera as well. So on one hand with the OnePlus 13, which yes, very detailed, but it is also very processed. Well, relatively speaking, a lot more processed. It's not horrible amount, the processing. There's definitely some sharpening going on. We can very easily make out all the places where it's happening with the textures and everything, just popping out a lot more on the OnePlus. But the Xiaomi 14 Ultra, it goes for a very natural approach. Now, on the ultra-wide camera, I feel it could use a touch of sharpening because it looks a little mushy. A lot of the details, especially in the shadows, look really mushy and kind of smudged out. And honestly, I don't think that's something that I really want when it comes to high res. I don't mind a touch more sharpening, but I do think that it could have actually helped out with a lot of the details. But well, that's not really the approach that Xiaomi goes for now, is it? Now then, let us move on to the telephoto camera. So, of course, the OnePlus only has a 3x, but the Xiaomi 14 Ultra does have a 3x and a 5x, and maybe it's because of that reason, but I do think that the Xiaomi's 3x isn't quite the best out there. And so cropping in all the way to 500%, I think you can very easily tell. The Xiaomi 14 Ultra, it does have slightly less detail, especially in the shadows. There's a bit of, once again, the mushing going on the Xiaomi, but we also get more processing and bits of sharpening and haloing that I can see around a lot of the dots, as opposed to the OnePlus, which feels a lot more naturally detailed. But of course, the Xiaomi does kind of try and make up for it with literally another camera, the 5x. Now, of course, the 3x shots will still look not as good, but the 5x will at least make up for long range zoom. That's what I'm trying to say. I did tell you that the Xiaomi's 5x is very high quality, and this is kind of testament to that. The OnePlus 13, even though its 3x sensor quality is slightly better, or I guess image quality overall is slightly better as opposed to Xiaomi's 3x, the 5x is significantly far ahead, and the OnePlus can't really keep up in that regard. I mean, there's a very good reason why it costs less, right? At least like starting prices. Now, I'll give you another reason as to why the OnePlus costs so much less. It's the selfie camera. It's basically unusable in the way the images are processed. Honestly, one of my least favorite selfie cameras that I've ever used. Like, I anyways don't like taking selfies, but if I have the OnePlus, I'm not taking selfies. It's just not gonna happen. It doesn't matter who is around, it doesn't matter what I'm taking a photo of. There's no selfies happening because of one simple reason, and it's processing related. That's the worst part. Like, yeah, if the sensor was bad, then I could understand, okay, it's bad hardware. But if the processing is so horrendous, which you can probably tell, what OnePlus does is basically it'll cut out the subject and then artificially brighten me up, which is horrible. It looks like a shoddy Photoshop job, and that does not work, not in the slightest. However, when it comes to selfie portraits, it's not that bad. And that's kind of the surprising part. Well, maybe not, because after all, this is a processing problem, and well, the backgrounds don't look nearly as horribly detached from the subject as we saw with the regular selfies, which again, very odd. But well, that's just the way it is. So selfie portraits are still sort of usable on the OnePlus, but regular selfies, absolutely not. Now, of course, let us move on to portrait mode. So Xiaomi's portrait mode, right back when it launched, it was one of the worst. Now, it's actually gotten so much better to the point that I can actually say I kind of enjoy using it. Now, I'm more than certain that a lot of other people might not enjoy the way the Xiaomi's portraits work, mainly because you're limited to two very drastically different options. You don't really have a middle ground. That's the way I see it, because I really like using Leica portraits. It gives me tremendous amounts of contrast, as you can probably tell, and it looks stunning for a lot of photographs. But the OnePlus 13, it hits that middle ground and it hits it right. You're gonna get almost perfectly balanced images almost all of the time. And that's quite something, that is very important. Sometimes on the Xiaomi you're gonna get an image that looks really nice, better than the OnePlus, but a lot of other times you're gonna get images that just look weird and flat and maybe over brightened or something like that, and it just won't hit the right marks. And that can be problematic when it comes to human subjects, because the margin of error when it comes to human subjects or portrait photos is really low as opposed to many other regular landscape or architecture photos that you might take. I mean, even with the night portrait, the Xiaomi 14 Ultra is going a little too crazy with the contrast, and it's almost making the background, the night sky, not look like the night sky at the very least. It's very odd the way the processing can sometimes just mess up entirely. That is exactly why I feel like a middle ground, very similar to what the OnePlus does, would have been perfect, like a default mode. But thankfully that is not the case when it comes to regular night mode shots, because I'd say that the Xiaomi 14 Ultra is easily one of my all-time favorites when it comes to night mode, because it gives you such beautiful, natural and high contrast and almost perfect looking night shots that I honestly don't have much to complain about at all. This is especially true when you're using Leica Authentic, and Leica Authentic is really what brings night mode to life. The OnePlus, on the other hand, it is kind of similar. It goes for a slightly natural approach, but still it'll give you far lower contrast, far more detail in the shadows, and just go for a much safer approach. Because you see, especially when it comes to the ultra-wide camera, it is more than obvious that a lot of the shots end up looking very stylized, very high contrast with quite a few cross shadows, and that's not something that a lot of people might want. That's just the way I'm putting it. And even though I love how the Xiaomi 14 Ultra does things, I'm going to leave room for you guys to decide exactly what kind of night mode shot you want. OnePlus is safer, the Xiaomi is, technically speaking, a lot more realistic. Anyways, let's move on to zoom at night. Starting off with the 2x sensor crop, we definitely have a lot to be desired on the Xiaomi 14 Ultra with the processing department. Now the OnePlus, it does look slightly processed, slightly sharpened, but the detail is so much higher on the OnePlus because it is processing that at night at least, the 2x sensor crop actually takes a lead. Now then for 3x, I would say that the Xiaomi's 3x is not particularly a strong point for it now, is it? But when we crop into 500%, oddly enough, the OnePlus 13 actually has less detail and more over processing and grain happening. And then of course 6x, which is basically a sensor crop on the OnePlus 13 versus the 5x telephoto on the Xiaomi 14 Ultra. And while cropping all the way in, I think it is more than obvious that both of these phones have distinctive problems of their own. Basically the OnePlus 13, it has way too much processing and not nearly as much detail as you would hope, so it kind of just doesn't really work out, and 6x is not worth using almost at all when it comes to night mode at least. But then the Xiaomi 14 Ultra, it seems like it could have given us good detail, but for the love of God, I took like 5 different shots and I could not get anything that was more stable or less motion blurred up than this on the Xiaomi, which just, it sucks honestly, because I was holding my breath when I took a lot of these shots and it did not help whatsoever. And well, that brings us to the end of this comparison. So I'm gonna keep it nice and short. The Xiaomi 14 Ultra, it has a lot to offer, much more so than what you saw in the comparison, because the pro modes, the pro photography, videography and so on, the raw capabilities, it's beautiful that it can do. It is definitely for someone who is really interested in smartphone cameras and wants to play around with them, experiment with them, that kind of thing. But it's also very inconsistent, definitely something to bear in mind, especially the portrait mode. As much as it has improved, there's still a lot of room for Xiaomi to grow in the portrait mode department in particular. That's where my biggest complaint lies, thus far at least. On the OnePlus, there's, well, first and foremost, we have that scandal, which it doesn't really have a proper macro photography mode, which just, it blows my mind that we don't have proper macro photography. I actually didn't even try the ultra-wide camera. I'm not sure if it can be used for macro photography, but the 3x is basically full of digital crops. That's what I can think of based on the findings here. Like, we saw the same things here, right? It makes no sense to me. But outside of that, the biggest issue that I identified previously as well are the selfies. Like, everything else is good, it's manageable, it's up to par with most of the other flagships that we have, at least to a fair extent. May not be the best in any one of those situations, but it can definitely keep up, and because of its lower price tag, that alone means a lot. But the selfies, for the love of God, what is even going on with that? Like, just make it look as nice as the portrait selfies. That could be a bar that OnePlus can set and work towards. I don't even know what's going on with the selfies. That's the best way to put it. And the macro. Those two things, just I have nothing to say there. It is so awkward, the whole situation. But with that said, I hope you guys enjoyed, found this helpful, and well, if those two particular situations don't really cause problems, and if you're not that interested in professional modes, then the OnePlus 13 is a catch. I'll see you guys soon with more. Cheers.